In the previous two lectures, we discussed the differences between the biblical and Mesopotamian flood traditions. As presented above, these differences appear to be fundamental, exposing basic theological differences between the two cultures. Some scholars, such as Cassuto, even suggest that the changes made by the biblical scribes are deliberately polemic in nature, intended to emphasize the Israelite ideas of divinity and humanity. Other scholars, on the other hand, dispute this interpretation of the sources. They argue that the dissimilarities between the traditions should not be exaggerated and that the general picture should not be presented as too polarized. Let us briefly review some of these points of disagreement. A central issue we discussed before is the reasons for the divine decision to bring about the flood. According to the Mesopotamian sources, the flood was not punishment for sins. However, several scholars interpret these sources differently. At the conclusion of the Mesopotamian flood story, in a passage we did not read in full before, the gods Ea and Enlil argue over the justification for the flood.
Ea opened his mouth to speak, saying to the hero Enlil, "You, the sage of the gods, the hero, how could you lack counsel and cause the deluge? On him who commits a sin, inflict his crime. On him who does wrong, inflict his wrongdoing."
Ea basically claims here that if Enlil wanted to reduce the number of human beings, he should only have punished the sinners. This argument seems to imply that the flood was a punishment for sins, implemented collectively on humanity as a whole. According to this interpretation, the noise human beings made at the beginning of the story is actually a revolt against the gods. The cause of the flood is thus a religious sin. However, this metaphoric interpretation of the noise motif is problematic. A simple reading of the flood's circumstances reveals that the noise is not perceived by the gods as a sin. Rather, they treat it as a mere physical disturbance. In fact, the idea that senior gods dislike noise and that they tend to destroy those making it is known from other mythological works, such as Enuma Elish. Against this background, it seems that Ea's claims against Enlil do not imply that the flood was a punishment. Rather, Ea argues that Enlil should have acted according to moral consideration, and that he should have killed only the sinners instead of choosing the indiscriminating flood to solve the noise problem. You will find reading recommendations regarding this exegetical discussion on the course website. There is yet another type of sources that suggest that the Mesopotamian gods brought the flood as a punishment for moral sins. These are flood stories from the Greek world. Greek culture inherited the flood tradition from Mesopotamia. Several Greek flood stories present a later and adapted version of this tradition. In at least one of these, the flood is caused by human sin. Here, pre-Diluvian humanity is described as cruel and disdainful of traditional values. We therefore see that the biblical moral perception of the flood has an external parallel in a later Greek version. The origin of this development in Greek tradition is unknown. It may be a Greek adaptation of the Mesopotamian tradition, but it may also be an earlier idea that the Greeks inherited from the Mesopotamians. It is important to remember that the Mesopotamian material we possess probably represents only a small portion of the rich literary flood tradition. It is therefore possible that in the ancient world, maybe already in Mesopotamia itself, there existed a version that attributed the bringing of the flood upon the world to moral misconducts. The disagreement among scholars regarding the extent of polarity between Mesopotamian and biblical flood traditions is related to a bigger issue. Is biblical tradition unique among the ancient Near Eastern cultures, or is it a natural part of a regional legacy? Does the Bible suggest a religious revolution? What is the relationship between continuation and change in biblical thought? We will discuss these issues in the next unit.